Chapter 11, page 69. Joe continued to feel like everyone's poor cousin. He still had to wear his ragged sweater to practice almost every day, and the boys still teased him continuously for it. "Hobo Joe," they snickered. "You trying to catch moths with that thing?" One evening in the cafeteria, they found a new way to laugh at his expense. Joe had piled his plate high with a meatloaf and potatoes and green corn. He attacked the food with his knife and fork, shoveling it into his mouth. The moment he had cleared his plate, he turned to the boy next to him and asked him for his leftover meatloaf and devoured it just as rapidly. Over the noise of the cafeteria, he did not notice that someone had come up behind him, nor did he hear the snickering. When he finally paused, he turned around to find a half a dozen fellows from the shell house holding their dirty plates out to him. Grins smeared across their faces. Joe paused, startled and humiliated. But then, his ears growing red, he turned around, put his head down, and resumed eating. He was hungry nearly all the time, and he didn't want to walk away from perfectly good food because a bunch of jerks in jerseys. He dug too many ditches, cut down too many cottonwoods, foraged in the cold, wet woods for too many berries and mushrooms. By end of March, the freshman slump appeared to be over, and Joe had secured his spot in the number 3 seat. On April 6th, after a windy week, he had kept the boys off the water. Coach Albrechtsen decided to hold a race between all his crews, including the varsity, junior varsity, and freshman boats, out on Lake Washington. He gave the JV crew a head start of 3 boat lengths because they had been rowing so poorly. He had told the freshman crew at the end of his race in the 2-mile mark that the standard distance for freshman races. The varsity and junior varsity were to continue racing to the 3-mile mark. Albrechtsen lined up the boats and barked, "Ready, all, row," through his megaphone. Harvey Love, the varsity coxswain, was talking and missed the signal. The freshman immediately leapt out half a boat length ahead of the older boys. For a mile, the boats held their stroke rates and positions. The junior varsity was 3 boat lengths out in front. The freshmen were in second. The bow of the varsity boat was locked in place alongside the freshman boat's number 5 seat. Then slowly the varsity boats fell back to the 6th seat, the 7th seat, the stroke seat, and finally the coxswain seat. By the 1.5-mile mark, the freshmen had opened a sliver of water between the rear of their boat and the varsity's bow. They had just started to close on the junior varsity despite their head start. Normally, a crew would increase its pace to catch a boat in the lead, but so far the freshmen had not raised their stroke rate at all. A quarter-mile remained in the race, and the coxswain George Morey knew his crew had plenty left in the tank. Finally, he told them to kick the stroke rate up a couple of notches. They surged past the junior varsity and overall lead. When they reached the 2-mile mark, they were 2 full lengths ahead of both other boats. Morey shouted, "Way enough," and the freshmen pulled up, let their oars ride in the water, and coasted to a stop. But the other 2 boats finally passed them, and the freshman boys pumped their fists in the air. Boyles looked down at his stopwatch and saw the freshmen's 2-mile time and looked again. He had known they were getting sharp, but now he knew that they had the makings of something exceptional in his boat. What he didn't know was whether they were fast enough to beat California. On the day of the Pacific Coast Regatta, Friday, April 13th, the weather was near perfect. Joyce Simdars joined the 1,400 other boisterous students, dressed in purple and gold, the school's colors, as they boarded a ferry to watch the competition from the water. The university's marching band was already aboard. The band played fight songs, the brass instruments blaring at the kettle drums rattling. Joyce settled on a bench on the foredecks, sipping coffee in the sun. She was looking forward to watching Joe. She had taken a rare afternoon off from her live-in job at the judge's house. She needed a break. She needed the break. She detested the job. She had always loathed housework, but now she had to wear a ridiculous uniform and creep around the house as quietly as a dormouse, lest she disturb the judge. Now, sitting on the ferry, she was nervous for Joe since she knew how much staying on the crew meant to him, but she was happy to be out of the house, out in the fresh air and bright sunlight. The band changed over to jazz tunes, and the students began to dance out on the main deck. As the time for the first races grew near, the people on the private docks, backyard decks, and grassy slopes along the lake shore spread out blankets, pulled lunches out of picnic hampers, and tested out their binoculars ready to watch. Hundreds of boats began to form at the semicircle around the finish line. 2,000 more fans clambered aboard an observation train. The sides of the train cars were open, so as the train ran parallel to the race course, the riders could watch the races from the beginning to the end. All told, nearly 8,000 people had come out to watch the races. The university's football stadium didn't even hold that many fans. The Washington and California freshman crews could go first for a distance of 2 miles. Out on the lake, Joe sat in the number 3 seat. Roger Moore sat in the number 7 seat. Both were nervous, as were all boys. They had plenty of reasons to be anxious. Warm as it was on shore, and mildly stiff north breeze had sprung out in the mid-lake, and they would be rowing directly into it. That would slow their time and perhaps cramp their style. In the next few minutes of each of them would need to take more than 300 strokes, and if one of them missed just one of those strokes and caught just one crab, the race would effectively be over. The season in ruins. Joe surveyed the crowd assembled along the short line. He wondered whether Joyce was half as nervous as he was. At 3 p.m., the Washington freshmen paddled the shell parallel to the Californias. They did their best to settle their minds in the boat and waited for the start signal. The bow of the first boat drifted slightly to one side, and George Morey, Washington's coxswain, raised his right arm to signal that his boat was not quite ready to row. The boys straightened the bow. The band on the ferry boat stopped playing, the students stopped dancing, and the crowd neared the rails. Thousands along the shoreline raised their binoculars to their eyes. The starter called out, "Ready, all?" And the Washington boys slid their seats forward and sank their white blades into the water, hunched over their oars, and started straight ahead. George Morey lowered his right arm. Grover Clark and the Cal coxswain did the same. The starter barked, "Row!" California exploded off the line, rowing furiously and surging a quarter length ahead of Washington's bow. Having seized the lead, Cal dropped its stroke rate. Washington was rowing even fewer strokes per minute, but held its position just behind Cal. The boys had their mind fully in the boat now. Facing the stern, the only thing any of them could see was having back of the oarsmen in front of him. As they passed the quarter-mile mark, the two boats slowly came even. Then Washington began to overtake California. Methodically, seat by seat, the Washington's boys were rowing at remarkably low rate, but by the 1 mile mark, they had opened water on Cal. Their confidence surged. The pain in their arms and legs did not much bother them. They felt almost invulnerable. In the Cal boat, Grover Clark screamed out, "Give me 10 big ones!" And the standard call for rowing 10 mammoth strokes, as hard and powerful as each oarsman can muster. But Washington remained out in front by 2 boat lengths. At the mile-and-a-half mark, Clark called out for another big 10, but by now Cal's boys had given everything they had to give. Washington boys had done more. Had more. As they entered the last half mile, the headwind died down. Cheers began to rise from the semicircle of the boats and the beaches and the train. The loudest of all rows was the ferry boat full of students. Ahead by 4 lengths, George Morey finally called for a higher stroke rate, and Washington sliced through the finish line 4.5 lengths ahead of California, and almost 20 seconds ahead of the freshman course record. Shrill horns and cheers resounded all along the shores of Lake Washington. The freshmen paddled over to the California boat in a rowing race, and Victoria's crew traditionally had the right to collect the jerseys of the vanquished rivals. So Joe and the boys accepted the shirts of the Cal's crew and shook their hands and paddled off, exultant. The real celebration began when the boys were dropped off at the student ferry. Beaming, Joe bound up on his steps, searching for Joyce. At 5'4", she was hard to find in a surging crowd. Joyce had seen him, though. She worked her way until she finally emerged before Joe. He promptly leaned over, wrapping her in a sweaty hug, and lifted her off her feet. When the band began to play dance tunes again, Joe, barefoot in his jersey and shorts, took Joyce and twirled her once under his long, outstretched arms, and then they danced, careening around the deck, swinging, smiling, laughing, giddy under the blue Seattle sky.